in heaven. Father, we give thee thanks for this beautiful day. We give thee thanks for the opportunity we have to come together in this class and learn more about history and discuss those things that will help us understand better history and how we can be instruments in thy hand for the future. Father, we love thee. We are grateful for American heritage and for the very good people there and the good things that go on there. We say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. And welcome to Wendy, and
Thank you.
welcome Christina. It's good to have everyone here today. Well, we're going to pick up where we left off with our slideshow about the Constitution. And I'm really excited today, and I appreciate your prayer, Lori, because truly, by learning these things specifically, we'll be able to be better tools, sharper tools in God's hand as we try to advance the cause of righteous liberty in this country in the future. And so let's start then by looking at this slide here. Certainly a famous quote. I'm sure you all know it, and perhaps could quote it in your sleep. But who would like to read this for us?
I'll be happy to read it.
Thanks so much.
The Constitution was designed to work with only a moral and righteous people. Our Constitution, said John Adams, first Vice President and second President of the United States, was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Thanks
so much. This is a quote from President Benson's The Constitution, a Heavenly Banner. And if we remember, we were talking about last class why the Constitution was effective, and we were giving our different opinions and examples. So let's try to relate this quote then to that reasoning that we did last class about why the Constitution was effective. Let's relate it to this quote. What do you think?
Well, as people become more self-governed, their form of government can allow them more freedom, and that's exactly what happened here. And if the morality leaves, tyranny takes its place.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Right. I mean, if we think of the gospel and commandments, we know that commandments should be seen as wings to fly rather than as chains to bind. And it really just matters your own level of self-governance, whether you see them as chains or as wings. And certainly, as we think about constitutional principles and living under the Constitution, I think that's an appropriate analogy. And thank you so much for that great comment, Wendy. What else would we say about being moral and religious in order to truly live the principles of the Constitution?
Well, moral and religious are key words, and of course this is an underlying assumption, or he's stating that this is an assumption that people are moral, meaning they respect the laws of the land, they respect others. When we look at Kant's definition of morality, he talks about Immanuel Kant kind of defines the categorical imperative, or the golden rule, as being doing what you would have done to everyone. Your actions should be based on something that would be fair and right and just for everyone. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, the Bible talks also about similar principles, and you have to work within a society where there's that mutual respect. And religious, if you look at the word religious, L-I-G in religious means tied. If we're tied back to God, like ligament, ligare is the Latin for that part of that word. Religious people are tied to God, and therefore they might also be willing to, of course, if they're tied to God, they're going to work rightly within the laws of the land, especially since there was so much of a common religion that causes that morality.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was an insightful comment. And I think it's interesting to bring it back to what we were talking about on Monday with with one of the quotes by Elder Oaks. He talked about the great fundamental of the rule of law and not of men, and he said that that fundamental only works if we are able to follow the laws, right? And so of course we do need that self-governance. It really was made for a moral and religious people. Well, let's continue on then. I appreciate those comments. And can you see my slide now, or is it still transitioning?
Now I can.
Now we can see.
Okay, so it was a little bit of a lag there. Well, we're trying to work on that. Well, you might remember this from the other day. This is our apperception here. If we think about this shift then from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, please do try to think of it in this way, that the miracle of the Congress learning from the mistakes of the Articles of Confederation, having the faith to change, and being guided by God's hand to transform America's government is like the miracle of learning from our mistakes, having the faith to repent, and being transformed through the atonement. So now let's talk about that transformation then. There were some conferences that preceded the Philadelphia Convention. And the first was the Mount Vernon Conference from March of 1785. This is a very interesting conference held in George Washington's backyard. Some selected delegates from Maryland and Virginia debated interstate interests such as commerce and fishing and navigation on the Potomac River that divided the two states. The success of this conference led to the calling of a larger convention at Annapolis in Maryland the next year. And so all the states are invited to this convention. Only 5 attend, though, as you can see: New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia. But once again, we have a success, and they decide that as they work together, that their interstate commercial interests can only truly be protected by a stronger national government, because they believe that the Articles were just too impotent to protect their property rights and other rights. And so they agree that all the states should then meet in Philadelphia in May of the next year for the purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. And so we have this Philadelphia Convention that's popularly known as the Constitutional Convention because the Constitution came out of it. Of course, the delegates didn't know it would be that then. And so this Philadelphia Convention had 74 delegates invited to it, 55 attended. Of course, it's always interesting to see Rhode Island. They didn't send anyone, so they kind of missed out big time on a chance to make history. But how many of you, or have any of you been to Philadelphia?
I've seen this room.
Yeah, you've seen the room. Have you been inside or seen pictures?
Inside.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Would you describe it for us, Wendy?
Isn't this the one with the chair with the rising sun or the setting sun? Am I right?
That's right.
Is it called Liberty Hall?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Independence Hall. Got
it.
Yeah.
So that you could call this room perhaps Liberty Hall, Independence Hall. This is the old Pennsylvania State House.
Yeah, and isn't the Liberty Bell just outside?
Well, it used to be up in this balcony here. Can you see this screen with the two pictures?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. Yeah, if you see the little bell tower, the Liberty Bell used to be up there. It's now been taken down and moved across, but so not there anymore. But this is where all the events that we're going to talk about just in a second happen. So hopefully these pictures will give you a little bit of eye candy and set the context for you visually. Well, if we look at the dates then, from May to September of 1787, there were debates on and drafting of the Constitution. Of course, this was a radical move because the states had specific instructions from their constituents to amend the Articles and to do nothing else. But of course, they felt the hand of the Lord guiding them and inspiring them to make decisions that, as we know, would be a huge blessing for our nation and for the world. By September 17th, 1787, our Constitution Day, we have the Constitution signed. September 28th, the Constitution was sent to the states for ratification. And then between September and June 21st, 1788, we have debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists in these different state conventions for ratification. And so before the conventions, the two parties would talk about the issues, create many, many pamphlets, and try to sway people to their sides. Through the process, though, ratification was achieved. As you can see, the order of states ratifying up into New Hampshire on June 21st, 1788, which gave the Constitution the needed 2/3 for official ratification. And then, of course, there was subsequent ratification as well, giving us a unanimous, I think of unity within union, a unanimous showing of approval for this Constitution. It took some a longer time than others, of course. Notice who's last, Rhode Island. May 29th of 1790. The government was underway by that time, and they finally conceded that it was a good thing. March 4th, 1789, we have government under the Constitution beginning operation. April 30th, 1789, Washington took the oath of office as the first president under the Constitution. So if we look then and think about this Constitutional Convention or this Philadelphia Convention, what two issues do you think could be called the convention breakers? Meaning, what two issues, if they hadn't been resolved, could have made it impossible for the states to create a new constitution? I'd like to hear your reasoning about this question.
Well, I know that a
guessing
big
a Bill
one
of
was
Rights.
just between. Oh, sorry. Oh, should I keep going?
Sure, please do.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I know a big one was just between the states getting state representation versus representation by population, which would give the larger states a greater chance to pass laws.
Yeah.
So representation in the Senate and House of Representatives and whatnot.
Excellent. So the issue of representation, definitely. Thank you so much. Certainly a convention breaker. What else would perhaps the other convention breaker be?
The Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights.
Slavery?
Yeah, well, those are both incredibly important issues. The Bill of Rights actually would be talked about only the last couple days of the convention after things were pretty much decided. That would be an issue for the ratification conventions. So actually it wasn't one that was a central issue of the Philadelphia Convention. But Mr. Anderson, you are correct. The other convention breaker was slavery. And if we think about these issues, it'll be interesting to try to break them down and understand why they were just deal breakers for the delegates. Well, let's look at the first convention breaker then. Of course, as Christina was saying, we have large states versus small states. The working model for the entire convention was Madison's Virginia Plan. And then a little bit later, of course, that plan would be compared and debated against the New Jersey plan proposed by William Patterson. Well, this Virginia plan, as you probably well know, proposed proportional representation, meaning take away all state boundaries, right? These sort of artificial dividing lines that we've created geographically to be these political markers that designate territories that we talk of as states. He said, forget that. He said, represent people, not states, which of course smacks at the principle of popular sovereignty, right, which will be at the heart of the whole convention. And so this is an ingenious proposal. Of course, it makes the three largest states incredibly happy, right, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. At the same time, it really worried the small states. And so we had Patterson's New Jersey plan saying, well, let's just have equal representation like under the Articles of Confederation. Let's have each state get the same number of votes. That way you can protect small states against the potential tyranny of majority within larger states because, of course, large states under proportional representation could outvote every time the interests of smaller states if they wanted to. Of course, this was unacceptable to the larger states and also unacceptable to those who were purists thinking about the principle behind things because Madison's idea to represent people, not states, was incredibly influential. And so, of course, enter Roger Sherman. I'm sure we know these things. Perhaps just a little review, though, for us. We have this Connecticut Compromise or the Sherman Compromise. As we know, equal representation in the Senate to appease the small states and proportional representation in the House of Representatives, which sort of appeased the large states. Many of them were still wounded by this loss of principle. And so you have what comes out of this great compromise is what is known as parallel sovereignties. And who'd like to just read this little quote here about parallel sovereignties?
I will. Idea
Thanks so
of
much.
parallel sovereignties. Since any piece of legislature would have to pass each house independently, both the people and the states could be sovereign at once. A measure unacceptable to the American people would fail in the House, and a measure unacceptable to the American states would fail in the Senate.
Okay, so this is the theoretical explanation of parallel sovereignties. What do we think about it? Does it work that way on the ground?
I think it works. I think right now we're kind of seeing history unfolding with the health care legislation that has just gone through the House.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's got to go through a lot more to get past the Senate. And I think this is a good thing because if a piece of legislation is good, for the most part, it will make it through both. But if it's bad, it's not going to make it through both.
Yeah,
That's the whole.
so
That's the idea, anyway.
Yeah, yeah, no, certainly, right. A lot of this is in theory, but that is the theory behind it, and that's a great explanation of it, Lori. Thanks so much for that.
Can I add something?
Oh, go ahead, please do.
I think that in theory that concept works better before the 17th Amendment, but I think after the 17th Amendment it doesn't work as well.
And would you like to elaborate for the rest of the class, Wendy?
Well, senators used to be elected by their state legislatures, so there wouldn't be big money involved in the, there wouldn't be as much money involved in the race. There wouldn't the popular sovereignty wouldn't be as much of an issue. It would be more an issue of looking out for states' rights because the state legislature appointed them. And then they changed that with the 17th Amendment, making it a popular election. So really, to me now, both houses are just a measure of supposedly the American people. That's assuming that our congressmen were actually representing their constituents.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very perceptive, Wendy. I appreciate that.
Could I ask a question, a follow-up question to that? Are the when we say that a senator represents a state, what does that mean? Does that mean that they would vote with the majority of the state? You know, if 70% in a state wanted a particular measure, both senators would vote for that measure because it would pass in the state, say? Or what does that exactly mean that it represents the states? Can you distinguish?
Yeah. Well, actually, if you could hold that thought just for a few slides, we're going to talk about sovereignty and through consent and the different types of representation that consent is based on in just a little bit. Would that be all right to postpone that for a second?
Certainly.
Sure. It sort of gets to this idea of attorneyship representation versus virtual representation, and anyway, so we'll get to that. And if we don't answer it, please ask it again. It's a great question. Well, the convention breaker number 2, of course, was this issue of slavery, right? North versus South. You know, and it's interesting. I think it is very easy for us, you know, to condemn the delegates to this convention for what they didn't do, meaning didn't get rid of slavery at this time. But we have to step back and ask ourselves, you know, what was the purpose of the convention? It was not to build a better society. It really was to create a better government. And so compromise ended up being the price of union. Even though, of course, we could see it as a missed opportunity. And so there were these 3 compromises that, you know, in many ways were certainly very sad. But we have, in other ways, were at least a little bit of a remedy. Importation of slaves was to end by 1808. 1807 was the last year that people could import slaves to the United States. Of course, over 1 million more came in the course of events between 1787 and 1808. Also, a slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation and representation. This was an old number pulled out of some article of Confederation law that James Wilson brought to the convention. And so this was sort of more than half a loaf for the South in terms of taxation and representation, and appeased the North by not giving the South property that they could also count as people, because they considered them property, as well as this last compromise that fugitive slaves needed to be returned to the South because the delegates were specifically looking at slaves as property, and so to protect property, the national government needed to agree to that. And of course, that was one of the things that compromise was contingent upon. And so we have these 3 compromises that keep slavery in America's midst. And really, you know, this issue will be decided only by the Civil War, and 620,000 lives will be shed to finally, you know, rid the country of slavery. So, of course, this is an issue that doesn't just go away, but at least they're able to move past it, so they can get on with the Constitution and have union on that issue. So, if we think about these issues, then, why do you think they were so crucial to the ultimate success of the convention? And Wendy, to answer your question, Britain stopped the slave trade in 1807.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one other question: if if they hadn't have had the deal breaker over representation, would we have ended up with a bicameral legislature, or would it have just been, you know, a House or a Senate?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you read in Max Ferran's records, which is just a compilation of primary sources from the convention, you'll notice that if the issue of representation hadn't been cleared up, there's very little hope that the rest of the convention would have even taken place. They probably would have just gone back home, dissatisfied, still with the Articles of Confederation under their belts.
But what was the initial proposal? Was it for unicameral or a bicameral?
Oh, yeah, no. It was going to be bicameral, but it was going to be based on proportion.
So both houses would have been based on population?
Mm-hmm. That's right. It was just that they were hoping that the Senate would represent sort of the cold or disinterested interests, sort of, you think of the idea of the landed gentry in Great Britain, that sort of a thing. Of course,
like
we couldn't quite replicate that here. So they would have the longer term, they would be chosen among the elite, whereas the House was supposed to represent what the founders called the hot interests of the people, the passion that was more closer to the ground.
So like the state legislatures would have still elected the senators, and they would have had a longer term?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does it mirror the House of Commons and the House of Lords in England?
Well, you could say so slightly in a way, but at this time, the House of Lords was, the members of it were chosen by the king, and so of course that's a very big difference. Even though in some ways you could see it as sort of the House of Lords representing the more dispassionate and disinterested and more virtuous interests, whereas the House of Commons as a better reflection of the people themselves at large.
Okay.
And to answer your question here, did they have to have a majority or a supermajority or unanimity to pass the Constitution?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so they were going for majority, simple majority.
Just 50% plus 1.
That's right. To pass these individual issues. At the same time, though, they were working for unanimity as much as they could, just because if they were going to present this to the American people, they wanted to say that it was something that truly if they were going to present a new national government to the American people, they wanted to say that it truly represented the best interests of everyone, and so they tried to get as many people on board as possible.
So when you say these two issues were deal breakers, then it was about 50-50 split on each of those issues?
Oh, sure, yeah. And I mean, for example, when these issues came up in the beginning, if you look at the convention, many of them at the beginning fell flat on their face, and so they kept bringing them up and reworking them and reworking them and reworking them, and slowly they'd gain votes, and then it'd be closer to 50-50, and then it would slowly, you'd get that majority.
Well, then I guess that's the answer to the question.
That's right.
Because if the convention wasn't successful, there's always the possibility that that there could have been anarchy. There could have been some chaos in the society, and so the ultimate success of the convention was paramount because they had the opportunity to unify the nation for good.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much.
Not just
for
temporarily and not just kind of a loose-knit organization, but to unify it once and for all, and to not have the risk that there would be civil strife.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that comment, Lori. Well, if we move on then, let's think about the Constitution. So here they are trying to solve problems. What problems did the Constitution that they created solve? What would you reason?
We'll give the national government an opportunity to tax, which would help with the revenue, with paying back debts and having enough money to do the things that the nation needed to do.
Definitely. What else? Did a lot of things.
Did it legitimize our nation as a sovereign government to the rest of the world?
Yeah, so in many ways, the power given to the central government allowed us to start playing with the big boys, so to speak, on an international stage. We wouldn't be trampled over anymore by Spain and Great Britain and France. Any other problems that the Constitution solved?
Well, it solved. It ended up spreading power to 3 different branches and more than one house of the legislature, and I assume they were eventually able to cover the costs of the war.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then it would have maybe taken, I don't know, did it solve the inflation problem?
Slowly, through the genius of Alexander Hamilton. Yes. Well, let's look specifically then. You may remember this slide here. And so, of course, this government is impotent no longer, meaning without power no longer. In many ways, it was the worst nightmare of some of those people who were worried about trading King George for another oppressive centralized government. At the same time, if that government wasn't able to protect the rights that had been fought for during the Revolution, then what was the purpose of it? And so really we have many people on the fence about it, and did so many wonderful things though that as we look at, hopefully we'll be able to appreciate. So of course, we go from having no power to tax or raise armies to the power granted to tax and raise armed forces. The source of power is this federalism that we've talked about. We know that there is a bicameral legislature with that great compromise from Roger Sherman, equal representation in the states, in the Senate, and then proportional in the House. The amendment process, instead of unanimous, now it's 3/4. There's an executive and a judicial branch. So some big changes here. If we look at this, we have this quote from Jack Green. Walter, would you read this for us?
Is he here?
Oh, I guess he's not here yet. I just had a tutorial with him, but I guess he hasn't arrived. Well, let's see. Who else would like to read this then?
I'll read it.
Thanks
To save the Republic and to provide adequate protection for the liberty and property for which the Revolution had been fought. Many were more than ever persuaded required. Did I read that right? Many were more than ever persuaded required strong medicine in the form of an energetic central government that could check the popular excesses of the states.
Great. And so as we'll see, of course, the Constitution achieves this goal in many ways. And so let's look at some of these ways then. How does the Constitution's strengthening of the national government relate to, if you remember, Brad talked about this donut principle. I wanted to bring it out again because I thought it was a neat illustration in which authority is the inner circle and responsibilities are the outer circle of an imaginary donut. How would you relate this principle then to the Constitution?
Well, with the power to tax, they actually have the authority to carry out the responsibilities they have. Mm-hmm.
Right. So they have certain responsibilities, but now they actually have the authority to make them work and to fulfill them. Well, let's keep going then. Well, there's some in terms of problem solved, right? We have this amazing concept of federalism, incredibly creative, and of course it's linked directly to popular sovereignty, which is the key that holds it all together. So let's see, Christina, would you read this one for us, please? Oh, she's putting Josh to sleep. Okay, never mind. What about Wendy? Would you read this for us, please?
In the Federalist system, they did not deny the principle of sovereignty, but relocated it in the people at large. In doing so, they forged an entirely new way of thinking about the relation of government to society. It marked one of the most creative moments in the history of political thought. By locating sovereignty in the people rather than any particular governmental institution, the Federalists could now conceive of what previously had been a contradiction in politics. Two legislatures operating simultaneously over the same community, the very issue over which the British Empire had broken.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that. And then Gordon Wood continues, he said, only by making the people themselves, and not their representatives in the state legislatures or in the Congress, the final supreme lawmaking authority, could the Federalists explain the emerging idea of federalism, that unusual division of legislative responsibilities between the national and state governments in which neither is final and supreme. Thus, sovereignty remained always with the people, and government was only a temporary and limited agency of the people, power on loan. So if we think about that quote then and relate it, how do you loan power to the government?
By creating it in the first place.
Excellent, right? So it goes way back to Locke. All of those principles, we have state of nature, social contract, government to protect natural rights, consent of the governed, popular sovereignty, the right of revolution, the people can change their own creation. Definitely. And then specifically,
by realizing that if I wish people would realize that if I don't have the power to do something as an individual, I can't give my government that right.
Excellent. Thank you for that perceptive comment, Wendy. And specifically, though, if we think about how also do perhaps we loan this power?
By voting, maybe?
By voting, right? I mean, that's perhaps one of the simplest ways we do it, but certainly, right? I mean, think of it. When you choose not to vote, then you choose to give up the power that is rightfully yours to govern your creation. And maybe you yourself didn't create it, but you recreate it every time you vote. At least you have the potential to. Well, if we look here. It's interesting, some of the other problems solved that we'll talk more about all these issues are these auxiliary precautions. This phrase comes from Madison, Federalist 51. And Lori, would you read this one for us, please?
Sure. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control on government, but experience has taught, my experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions.
Thank you for that. So keep those words in mind, and then let's think a little bit more about this here. The fundamental idea behind Madison's auxiliary precautions had emerged in the European Enlightenment. In simplest terms, it was that the power of self-interest could be utilized to control self-interest. And the framers called this counterpoise. Another famous line from Madison is that ambition must be made to counter ambition. And if you remember James Harrington, he had this great analogy of children and a cake. And he said the best way to make sure things are fair is if you give one the knife and you let that person cut the cake, and then the other person gets to choose which piece. And so you have these competing interests, right? It's in my interest, if I want a big piece of cake, to make sure I cut it right down the middle if we're only two of us, because if I don't, then that other person would easily choose that bigger piece if he's or she is, self-interested. At the same time, of course, it's in my self-interest, once the cake is cut, to choose the piece that I want the most. And so, you see ambition countering ambition. Well, if we think about this and apply it then, can you reason, what are some examples of auxiliary precautions in American government? And there are lots of them.
You mean like checks and balances, specific checks
Mm-hmm.
and balances? Okay, so Congress can create a law, but Supreme Court can declare it constitutional, and the president can veto it, stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So checks and balances would be a great umbrella that covers a whole host of them. And then what would some other umbrellas be?
Well, just a general one
Can
is
be impeached.
Mm-hmm.
a general one too is that whatever law they create, they have to live.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Which doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Right.
Especially with tax laws.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Lori. And then Brad, I'm not sure, can you hear us, Brad, or can you, you must be able to hear us, but I see Brad typed in here, he said the power of government is the authority we give it to enforce law. He said police and military. I'm not sure if he's unable to comment now. I'm not sure if there's a technical glitch, but we do appreciate that comment from him. Well, let's look at some of these then. Just a few. I mean, if you start looking, there's lots and lots and lots. But a few of them that are built into America's governmental system are popular sovereignty through consent, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, Madison's extended republic. So let's look at those then one at a time. What do you think is this popular sovereignty through consent? What does this look like?
Well, that we loaned government our power to begin with, but I don't think anyone's really, this is not on anyone's radar.
That's right, and so this is something that certainly was on the founders' radar, but I'm not sure if the plane went out of range or what. Let's look then. So popular sovereignty through consent. There's two different types of consent. If we look at this issue, first of all, you have a reenactment of the social contract through one. Either the original creation of the Constitution itself, or two, the consideration of constitutional amendments. Because when you do that, if you pass the amendment, you consent to a new Constitution. And so this is what you would call original consent. This periodic consent is probably the type of consent we think about most often, just because we don't have too many amendments that we get to vote on. But voting in periodic elections, right, that's this periodic consent. And then, of course, as we are voting, right, we are voting through all of these filters of consent. For example, we have direct and indirect elections. So a direct election, of course, would be representatives. An indirect election would be the president, right? Because we don't vote for the president, right? The Electoral College chooses the president. We don't vote for the Supreme Court directly. We vote for the president, or we vote indirectly for the president, and the president then directly chooses members of the Supreme Court. Of course, they're all there's checks and balances in that process. But if you could think of direct and indirect elections, of course, there are staggered elections. For example, a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. Also, we have overlapping terms of office, which form another filter of consent. Some are for 2, for 4, for 6, or for quote-unquote life or good behavior. Well, if we look at separation of powers, then, how would you explain separation of powers in your own words?
Dividing up responsibility so that one body creates law, one enforces, one judges the law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. And you know, it's interesting if you study this concept, that wasn't the way it always was. There used to be a traditional notion of separation of powers, which was a two-way separation. There was a rule maker and then a rule enforcer. One of the genius moves of the convention was to create this three-way separation, which harkened back to Montesquieu talking about separation of powers in his The Spirit of the Laws from 1748. So we have, of course, as Wendy mentioned, these three branches. Excuse me. It's also interesting to note, though, that this is not a total separation because that risks deadlock, right? Also, it's not a separation in which one power can gain total control of the others because, of course, that's the other extreme, which risks tyranny. And one of the most amazing things, at least for me to consider, is how separation of powers is actually enhanced by the sharing of powers in a checks and balances system. And so when we think about this, we need to realize that the same kind of powers must be shared to maintain the strength and independence of each branch. And of course, at the very foundation of all of this is this great principle that James Wilson from Pennsylvania brought up again and again, is that all powers are derived from the people. The people are behind it all. Well, let's keep going then for the sake of time. We've got lots of great things to talk about. Of course, we could talk about this for years and years, and hopefully we'll continue to study it throughout our lives. But if we think of checks and balances, right, this has been brought up a couple times today. In fact, I would say that this is probably the concept that we seem to know about the most, you know, and we're really proud of it because this is a great Republican mechanism of our Constitution. Of course, we have a bicameralism in the Congress, right, with the House and the Senate. We have things like power of appointment. Okay, for example, the president's appointments are subject to the advice and consent, quote, of the Senate. War-making and foreign policy, we see lots of checks and balances in this area. For example, the president negotiates foreign treaties, but the Senate must ratify them. Congress has authority to declare war, but the president takes charge of the fighting as the commander-in-chief. The president conducts military operations without a declaration of war, but if he does that, or she, Congress then has the right to refuse funding the operations. So we see lots of checks and balances in this system. powers of investigation and impeachment. Wendy brought those up before. It gives choice and then accountability for leaders. So lots of gospel principles in here, as we can see. This is just a diagram of some of these checks and balances between the executive, legislative, and judicial. You can see that they each share powers with the other two. We don't have to read these all, but this PowerPoint will be up there for you. I would, though, point to something that I think is a very interesting and controversial issue. It's this idea of judicial review, which was not part of the founders' plan at the Constitutional Convention, but came later in the Marbury versus Madison case that John Marshall, a Supreme Court justice, ruled on in 1803, which gives the judicial branch the ability to determine the constitutionality of laws, which was not something that the Philadelphia Convention wanted the judicial branch to do. So we have that since 1803, and we have lots of people who talk about that as one of the main checks and balances at this point. But we can see if judges start legislating from the bench at the Supreme Court level, how dangerous that can be. Anyway, sort of throws things off kilter. But just know that that wasn't part of the original plan. It came a little later. Well, if we think about federalism then, what is federalism? How would you explain it?
A central authority.
Okay. Any other explanations? Federalism is an interesting concept that, I'm sorry, was somebody going to say something?
I was just going to say it's kind of the sharing, or the kind of parallel of state powers and national powers, what I understand it.
Yeah, that's right. Because we talk about the federal quote-unquote government today, and we use that synonymously with the national government, I think the meaning of federalism has been lost on today's students of history. But if we really look at federalism in the view of the founders, right, it was a federal separation of powers and a federal system of checks and balances. What that meant, their understanding of the word federal, okay, was shared but separated powers among national government and states governments. And so if we think about this here, we have national and state governments that are different agents and trustees of the people, constituted with different powers and designed for different purposes. So we have some that are sovereign in some instances, some that are sovereign in others. It's this sharing of sovereignty, this parallel idea of sovereignty. There's a quote here at the bottom. Once the people were regarded as the supreme and continuing repository of all political power, distributing some of it to their agents in the state governments, some to their agents in the national governments, and reserving the rest, then it followed that all governmental power, whatever its nature or function, was something of a delegation by the people. So once again, all of these ideas at their heart go back to, you could say Locke, or you could just say this eternal principle of government, if you will, that there's agency, right? We fought about it in the War in Heaven. The fight continues today. It's government of the people, their consent, their true sovereignty. And that sovereignty is expressed on the state and national levels in this shared, separated sort of way. Well, if we think about the extended republic, I'm not sure how familiar you might be with that one, but what do you think? What is this extended republic idea?
Well, a republic, doesn't that just mean you have representatives who vote for you instead of in a democracy where the people vote on the laws? I don't know what I don't know what extended republic means.
Yeah, well, let's look at it, because this is another unique contribution of the American Constitution, which is just amazing. And Federalist 10 is the great treasure trove for information about this idea of an extended republic. And so if you look at Federalist 10, it talks about how in a large republic, large is the key word. That's what he meant by extended. The number of interests and factions in the society would increase to the point where they would check one another and make it less likely that a tyrannical majority could combine in government and oppress minorities and individuals. And so if we think about this, this perhaps isn't so important to us today, but to the founders it was incredibly important, because most of the great political minds of the 17th and 18th centuries had said a republic will only work if it's small. It has to be small to maintain virtue. It has to be small to truly represent the people adequately. If it's too big, it just won't work. It will become corrupt, and basically it will lose meaning because you won't be able to represent the interests of all the little people involved in this great national government. But Madison said, well, wait, let's look at this again. Who would like to read this quote from Federalist 10 from Madison? It's a really neat one.
I will. The greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than of Democratic government renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer, probably, will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or, if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other.
Okay, so who would like to explain this concept then in his or her own words?
To me, it just sounds like economy of scale.
Okay, great.
You just, well,
I've got an explanation, maybe.
Sure.
And I'm thinking of it in terms of legislation, of course. You know, when you submit a bill, oftentimes it will go through various committees, or people will look at the bill and say, well, I'll approve that bill if you change such and such, if you add this clause, if you add this condition. And oftentimes the legislation will evolve and emerge from committee perhaps a far different animal than it entered.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, you know, and so that makes it very difficult for bills to overturn a government, because there are so many factions, so many people with different interests, that they try to keep things pretty much the same way. That's even true in businesses. You know, if you have a great new idea, sometimes it's best to break away and start a new business, because within a business it may kind of attach to the way things always happen as it goes through various committees. And so this, you know, it makes government move slowly, this principle.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for that. Well, if we look then, if we think about these different precautions, the most important thing to remember, just for the sake of time, is that you know, they really were to be auxiliary, helping, supporting. The center ring, if you think of this as a circus, was to be the American people peacefully living their lives. And so keep that in mind. Even though there are all these different precautions, checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism, extended republic, et cetera, at the heart of it all is people doing the right thing quietly in their everyday lives, and voting in wise men and women who will uphold the constitutional principles. That's the linchpin of the whole system. Well, if we think about how the Constitution has changed, just for the sake of time here, you know, it's changed in many ways, of course. What would be one way that the Constitution has changed many different times since 1787?
you mean amendments, for example,
Yeah.
like slavery?
Mm-hmm. Definitely, right? If we look at some of these here, of course, you know, there are many others. You know, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. Look at slavery, it's abolished. We have citizenship, due process, and equal rights in the 14th Amendment. Voting rights extended to all races. Okay, direct election of senators, federal women's suffrage, voting age to 18, you know, et cetera, et cetera. We see the document as a living document, one of the great cases for its amazing ability to change society, is that it changes with society. And so if we think about which amendments are the most important to us, what would you say and why, if we relate this?
I think clearly slavery, ending slavery, has got to be Well, I mean, I'm looking outside the Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm.
Or are you including the Bill of Rights as well?
Well, I do include the Bill of Rights because it comprised the first 10 amendments, so you certainly could include those too.
Okay. Well, outside that, I think ending slavery is the most important. Inside that, I don't know, maybe the Second Amendment, because that's the one that enforces all the other rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Wendy. Well, if we look at these dates, then the Bill of Rights, of course we have debates over ratification, and the lack of a Bill of Rights was a major issue for anti-federalists, and so they have this great contribution in truly helping to make our country better in the fact that they raised these issues that had to be dealt with by the Federalists. A proposed Bill of Rights came on the table the 25th of September. Madison had authored the Bill of Rights. Once again, the contribution of Madison is just incalculable, and truly talk about the hand of God inspiring a man to do great work. Madison is truly an example of that. By the 15th of December, 1791, the last 10 proposed amendments, what we call the U.S. Bill of Rights, were ratified by the states. Article 1 and Article 2, the first two, weren't. Article 1 was about the apportionment of representatives. It has never been ratified. And then Article 2 about congressional pay raises, that was ratified in 1992 as the last amendment that we've ratified, the 27th. Well, you probably know these very well. 1 through 10, here we have the First Amendments are what we call the Bill of Rights. And as we think about them and why it's so important to have a Bill of Rights, what have we learned from history about why having a written Bill of Rights is so important?
Because those in power will always try to violate it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, right? If it's not written down, it's only implied. And if I don't assume the same thing you do about rights, well, then it's the rule of will versus the rule of law, and we have a problem. Of course, we have Elder Oaks who's talked about this, talking about how this is an inspired work. I'll skip this just for the sake of time. And I do like this quote, though. I've always thought it's very important. He said, "I have always felt the U.S. Constitution's closest approach to scriptural status is in the phrasing of our Bill of Rights. Without the free exercise of religion, America could not have served as the host nation for the restoration of the gospel, which began just 3 decades after the Bill of Rights was ratified." Of course, we have Patrick Henry, one of the most ardent and influential anti-federalists, talking about how, did no one know history? Did no one recall that in Britain the people and the crown had struggled for a century over the uncertainties of implied rights until the matter had finally been settled in the acceptance of an explicit Bill of Rights, this written English Bill of Rights of 1689. And that had been precisely the first thing the American people had thought of when they were faced with the necessity of protecting themselves against Parliament's power before or during the early stages of the Revolution. I love this quote from the Federal Farmer writing during the anti-federalist-federalist debates. He said that until there was a Bill of Rights, we are totally insecure in all of them. This is just what Laurie was saying. And no man can promise himself with any degree of certainty that his posterity will enjoy the inestimable blessings of liberty of conscience, of freedom of speech, and of writing and publishing their thoughts on public matters, of trial by jury, of holding themselves, their houses, and papers free from seizure and search upon general suspicion or general warrants, or, in short, that they will be secured in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property without depending on the will and pleasure of their rulers. So once again, think about one of the great fundamentals of the Constitution. It is the rule of law and not of men. The rule of law and not the rule of will. Well, as we're out of time, unfortunately, for today. But I do challenge you to think about. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Nick, you got to answer one question before you cut the class, and that is.
Oh, sure.
What is? I mean, as I'm listening to and learning more about the way our government is set up, and and how things get passed, all my studies say that that the founding fathers relied on biblical principles to determine the standard by which the issues would be brought up before the legislators. But that seems to be going away. Mm-hmm. And so, what is to protect the country from issues such as same-sex marriage? If the House and Senate become filled with people that agree with that.
That's a great question.
Are we then in the Book of Mormon's situation where, well, the majority, when the majority starts to vote in bad laws? I mean, are you following what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 I mean, this is truly the question of our times, and certainly I don't have the only answer. But of course, it does go back to education. At the same time, though, and this is one of the great principles of American Heritage School, education without the light of the restored gospel won't be enough. And so we do need to return to faith. We do need to return to righteous truths, principles upon which the Constitution was based. And if we don't have that return, I just can't imagine a secular society doing justice by a document that is supposed to uphold the laws of God. And so we need a return to virtue, a return to faith, a return to principles that do come from the Bible in so many ways. Basically, in the education of the American people, we need a return to the type of education that the founders received, the type of education that produced an inspired document that the Lord himself would accept. And if we don't have that type of people, I just can't imagine, given the arguments of secularism, how they would return to anything like that.
Can I just add one thing to what you just said? Our faith also needs to be based on the Constitution, on constitutional principles. Our faith needs to not just be based on our government, quote unquote, but our faith I believe anyway, should be based on constitutional principles. And the Constitution enumerates what those are. And the Book of Mormon enumerates what those are. And so that leads me to have less faith, I guess, in the actual government as it stands now. But I have great faith in constitutional principles.
Can I ask you a question?
Well, I'm sorry. I actually have a PE class that I'm supposed to teach.
Hey, you're messing with our conversation here, Nick. I'll cut off here.
I know. I'm very sorry. And can I just say, I count it as a blessing to have such rich, properly passioned, conversation from everybody, and I think it's just wonderful, and that's what the class is supposed to be about, and I just thank everybody for it. Certainly this is not the end. We can continue to talk about all these great things, but I would just challenge you. I'm sure you've read Elder Oak's talk about religious freedom. If you haven't, please read it again, or read it for the first time if you haven't. Read it again if you have, and think about how the Bill of Rights relates to his talk about religious freedom. A masterful talk. I wish we would be able to study it for the whole year. Anyway, but thanks so much for your great reasoning and relating about the Constitution, and I do hope it was helpful. The only other thing I'll say is that I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving, and we will not have any classes or tutorials next week. We'll meet up again to talk about the beginnings of the French Revolution with the PowerPoint about the music and art from that period on November 30th. Okay, so have a good day, everybody.
Hey,
And just so you know, some of us might not be able to hear the music, just the art.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome.